Good evening, and welcome to the Adham Center for Television and Digital Journalism. On behalf of the Adham Center, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to this wonderful event. I think the program started by initiatives from the American Embassy in Cairo. This virtual speaker program is one of the most popular in our field right now because we share it with everybody, and a lot of experts, professionals, students asking me questions about, how they can get in, and in other universities as well that they want to replicate the experience. So I need to thank the American Embassy in Cairo, and thank in particular Maxwell, man, because he is the man behind everything since we started this initiative. I would like also to thank Dina Tawfiq. Dina?
I'm here.
Dina, I'm here. Okay. And all members of the team, either here in Cairo or in the US, especially Simon, who did a lot of work, as I understand it. And I would like also to thank all members from the Adham Center for Television and Digital Journalism, namely Rania Abu Wafa, Hassan Labib, and of course, my executive assistant, Salma Al-Rizani. Today, the Cairo virtual program is inviting Dr. Paul Mihailidis, one of the world's top scholars in the field of digital journalism, and also popular leader. His name actually, as I was sharing this with him a few minutes ago, was discussed among the top experts in the field of media literacy and youth engagement. Paul is the director of the Salzburg Academy on Media and Global Change, founding graduate program director, MA in Civic Media. He is an associate professor in the Department of Marketing Communication, School of Communication at Emerson College. He is the author of Media Literacy and Emerging Citizen, among other popular publications. Today, Paul is going to present to us a new and interesting topic on trends and best practices in digital journalism. I'm sure that all of us are eager to listen to Paul and, of course, raise questions. Please join me in welcoming Paul.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and thank you to the Adham Center for hosting me, and thank you for to the Embassy and the State Department for also helping support this trip. So I guess my first question, everyone can see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I wish I could be with you there in person, but absent of that, it's wonderful for me to have the opportunity to share some of my new work with you, and to hopefully provide some interesting reflections and ideas that we might use to launch into a conversation after some short remarks. So, and if at any point you feel the need to stop me or you'd like to ask questions, please just let me know. I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to share my screen now with everybody. Can you all see this okay? Great. So like Dr. mentioned, trends and best practices in digital journalism or digital communication. And I'd like this to be an expansive and maybe a provocative set of principles that I provide I would like this to be something that's expansive and that allows us to look forward into really some of the larger structures that are challenging the practice of digital journalism, and some of the ways that we are experimenting here in Boston, but also in my work in Salzburg and my work each year in Beirut, Lebanon. We are practicing on experimental modes of storytelling and journalism. And if I can share some of the things we found there, maybe that will lead to some interesting dialogue. So just quickly, some of my background that was just mentioned. I'm based in Boston at Emerson College, where I'm an associate professor in the School of Communication. I also started and run a graduate program, an MA in civic media there, which is within something called the Engagement Lab, which is an applied research laboratory where we build technologies and we design programs and practices that help push the future of civic engagement and journalism and storytelling forward. And I'm also running a project in Salzburg for 12 years where we gather young journalists from over 30 countries around the world, studying journalists, everyone from PhD and MA students to young aspiring journalists together for 1 month in Salzburg. And we really look to form networks where journalism can be a force for global change. So this is a little bit of my work. I think it's important in case you're interested in any of these programs. This is some of the work that I have published, just so you see where my work is, looking at the intersection of media, news, and engagement, and engagement in technology. And I have a background where I studied at the University of Maryland in their Philip Merrill College of Journalism for 7 years before starting my academic career. So that's a little bit about me. And now I would love to turn to some of my thoughts. I'll try to spend about 20 minutes sharing my thoughts and then have the rest of the time where we can open for discussion. And again, if you need to stop at any time or you have questions, please let me know. But I would like this conversation to be framed around this idea of the title we talked about were kind of trends and strategies in digital journalism and digital communication. So the first thing I'd like to do is offer you what I see are what I'm calling new emerging norms of digital culture that are shifting our relationship with information. So I've been working on a new project and a new book that will be completed by the end of the year, where we're really thinking about how we reimagine news and journalism. And I've been talking to young journalists around the world, and I've found that there are 3 emerging norms of digital culture that I would consider complicating our relationship with information, our engagement with audiences, and our ability to tell stories. And I would like to present those 3 as trends and then move to the point of strategies. And each of these trends, I have some examples that may or may not be familiar, but I will show them here. So the first trend that I have noticed is this phenomenon of spectacle. And I can read from my notes here. It says legacy digital and social media platforms have become increasingly partisan, commodified, and polarized spaces of confrontation, where young people are subject to highly personalized information design, greater targeted advertising, and content that breeds reductionist expression. This phenomenon of spectacle is not new, but I want to stop. And have us consider networks that journalists are increasingly playing in. So what I call here new legacy networks. When I consider spectacle, these networks that we consider that were born and articulate this narrative of spaces for open dialogue and engagement are really designed intentionally and through the design of sophisticated algorithms that are highly personalized and extractive, meant to extract data. And they do so by reinforcing things that are more sensational or spectacle, or things that are reductionist and can be more polarizing. Facebook, Google, YouTube, they have the guise of being open platforms where anyone can participate. which I think increasingly is less true. And I think this is causing it's causing challenges for the way that journalists work. And I'll tell you why. So a site like YouTube, where you have over 70 hours of video content uploaded to that platform every minute, or a space like Facebook, where you have billions of users, especially in growing developmental areas, that are going onto these platforms and being placed into what are now completely commodified spaces. There's little room for open dialogue. There's little room for there to be a serendipitous sharing of ideas. Google is the same way. Twitter is similar in its ability to codify targeted users. This has a few implications for us. The first is that these, by their design to gather data and to push people further into corners, they end up creating siphoned and homophilous networks. So self-serving networks, they're very much directed towards personal expression. And they put people together with like-minded like-minded thoughts and ideologies and values. The result of that is that people become much more separated into like-minded communities across these platforms. It's self-reaffirming. The problem with what's happening with journalism and media outlets is they increasingly opt into these networks because it's the way that they can monetize their storytelling. It's the way that they feel they can reach the most audiences. And in a sense, that's quite true. The New York Times, or even a place like Huffington Post, will go on. Every story gets posted through these networks, and it often is the place where they're having most of their initial connection with audiences comes through this ecosystem of networks. The problem with that is that they are only serving the networks that Facebook is designed to serve for them. So they can advertise, they can promote, they can do very strategic content marketing, which they do, but then they understand that the community is also a big role in how their stories share. So the problem of spectacle is that twofold. Number one is, to reach more audiences, the content has to be more sensational, because that's how Facebook is designed. And the second part is, to reach more audiences, they're reaching more people that are already thinking about their value and ideology system. And this is what allows us to move into my second point of trends in digital communication and journalism, which is this factor of distrust. Before I do that, I'll give you one example of how spectacle works. So how many people have seen this picture before? Is anyone there familiar with this green frog named Pepe? Okay, a few people are familiar with this frog. So Pepe is an internet meme, which was born in the mid-2000s simply as a cartoon and comic, and he was appropriated by internet communities. In the height of the political election, Pepe started to be used by alt-right and alt-left groups, and some of these images are a bit less appropriate than others. Pepe was starting to be used by politicians and by the counterculture of the internet to advocate views. So you see how he was appropriated to be seen. What happened with Pepe was that he grew so fast, and he was used so much to talk about global and international politics, that he became one of the top trending stories in the internet ecosystem. And he became picked up by the mainstream media in these networks. And actually politicians started to use Pepe. Our president started to use Pepe to reinforce his views, no matter how appropriate or inappropriate they were. The story of Pepe is really interesting because news organizations had to follow Pepe because he became such a phenomenon online. The spectacle grew to the point where it was legitimated by journalist organizations. And as a result, Pepe became a key narrative for audiences, citizens, and voters to engage in their views, but also for politicians to talk to audiences, and as a result, for journalists to also engage with audiences. Moving from spectacle to distrust, I think these are quite connected. The second trend in digital communication that we often have to think about beyond this notion of spectacular content rises in our digital ecosystem, that leads directly to distrust, because the more that people are in self-serving networks with one another, the harder it is for them to build strong relationships with public institutions. And so I write here, a crisis in legitimacy as evolving for decades, animated now by alternative media and politicians who openly question the basic functions of our public institutions. Trust in mainstream media is at all-time lows and deeply partisan. While startlingly obvious now, the trend is nothing new. So we have this culture of spectacle, and it's combined the notion that people can work in networks that serve self-serving interests, create the notion that our institutions should not need to be relied upon as much as in the past. So when we have, again, our political leaders calling the press an opposition party, it creates a culture of distrust and criticality that puts media institutions in very difficult spaces. So this notion of declining trust is quite a fascinating one, because a study that came out this year, a trust barometer study in 28 countries around the world, showed across the board, government, business, media, and NGOs, that trust is declining. Media had the most significant declines in trust, and most significant from past years to this year, but also compared to other, the drop was, as you can see in this chart, was fairly significant in relation to other ones. Now, in relation to other institutions. There's some reasons for that, right? The reasons that media and news are very ideologically driven. It is how people make sense of the world. We know, as studying journalism and communication, the link between the role of a journalist and the role of civil societies. Media, I think, has been extra sensitive in this notion of distrust, because spectacle culture on the internet has grown and been normalized and been reinforced by these large technology companies. And also because of emerging things like this term fake news, which I underline because I think we would need at least 3 hours if we were going to unpack what has happened with fake news over the last year or so. But I want to relate fake news as something that emerges from a specific technological age and from a climate of distrust. So the technological age, it's allowed for this, the notion that we can create stories and ideas and propagate things that don't exist, is fascinating. And it comes from this notion of, let's look at these three attributes: distribution and cost. The costs of publishing and distributing are zero. When the costs are zero, audiences and trusts are allowed to change. Reputations are far more expendable. If everyone's in the same networks, being reinforced and told by peers that their information is valuable, they have the opening to trust less. And with much lower costs, far more operators involved with this exchange, there's less regulation. So I want to differentiate things like fake news from media bias and manipulation and advocacy work. Those things have been in journalism forever. We all know that journalists make choices, that media makers create choices. I want to specifically, the minute we start to include fake news in our discussions of media bias, we end up legitimating a term that seems to be emerging from this specific technological age with a specific articulation and understanding of what it's trying to do. Let me explain that to you quickly. So the first reason why it's very hard for us the first reason why we have this emerging lack of trust in media and the expansion of fake news. I use one professor from Penn State, Shyam Sundar, who he's a psychologist, but he's been looking at online news consumption for a while. And he has been doing some fascinating research that's showing that in an age where people are getting most of their news through social networks and technological platforms, that readers don't value sourcing and credibility as much as they prefer information that confirms ideologies and values over that which is accurate, he says. And there's a reason why this happens, and it's something called the layering effect. And the layering effect tells us that for us to get to a source of information online, most people have to go through 4 or 5 layers. So they will log on to a technology, they'll go into a social platform, they'll go into a news feed, and most things that are shared by friends or shared by other organizations with information that normally precedes that, opinions or understandings of a story, sent to them through a platform that doesn't claim to have anything to do with news. And that's always sharing continuously faster and faster and faster. So the idea that they can get down to source and credibility as an audience is really challenging because they're being bombarded with abundant information, again, designed to make them continually respond to it so that they can stay engaged and validated by their peers in communities that are controlled by their peers. That's a lot to say at once, but if we think about this process of how people receive news and where they're receiving it and how it's validated, you can see that there's an avenue for trust in peers that equates with an acknowledgement of distrust in media systems that people always think about as blameworthy because journalists often have to deal with complex situations. That combined with the idea that we don't have time to look at stories or that the way that digital networks are set up don't afford time to follow stories as they emerge, but they are really on from one thing to the next. So this is where a culture of distrust emerges. One other story that shows distrust was this idea of Pizzagate. I'm not sure how many folks have heard of Pizzagate before, but this is a story that started in Washington, D.C., by the hacking and leaking of Democratic emails in our 2016 presidential election. What the chief Democratic, John Podesta, who was the campaign chief of the Democratic Hillary Clinton's campaign, had his emails hacked. And an online group of what we sometimes call citizen journalists, called themselves citizen journalists, but were just concerned citizens, took these emails and did their own investigation and came up with the story that the Democratic National Committee was harboring a child sex operation in the basement of a pizza store in Washington, D.C. They came up with this theory. They came up with very complicated and articulated models to show how this theory worked. And they built this all online through places like Reddit and subreddits, where they had channels of millions and millions of people that didn't really care about the credibility of this information, but that really wanted something that confirmed their values or ideologies. So this story started to be shared millions of times. It started to be retweeted and reposted and appropriated, that all the mainstream media started to cover this. And here's where I think digital communication, this trend has an issue. The minute that digital media starts to cover these things, they become legitimated. They become legitimated as real things in the world because their audiences grow from the subcultures of the internet to the masses. And once the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and even online alternative sources like Breitbart News and the Huffington Post in the United States cover this, it becomes a legitimate story. And it becomes something like Pizzagate became one of the top trending stories within the last 2 or 3 weeks of the presidential election here in the United States, which was completely fabricated and made up to advocate a political or agenda viewpoint. So we don't really know as journalist organizations how we're supposed to respond to this. Is it newsworthy because so many people online are talking about it? Is it newsworthy because news organizations know that they will increase their engagement? They'll get more reads and more views and more people listening to them if they put this information out there? Or is it irresponsible for news organizations to be advocating for things that don't exist in the world. This is a really big question, this notion of distrust. This is also complicated by, again, technologies that when you're social engineering technologies to convince people that information is true, it's more simple because you see somebody and they look exactly like you, even down to the pictures. This is a quote by someone who was involved in the creation of bots or was involved in interrogating the creation of bots in places like Russia that were simply designed to take false information and create accounts and propagate it around the world. And these are very powerful, and we don't yet know how to deal with them, but we know that they further seed distrust. Another example of distrust, the problem is not fake news, but a digital capitalism that makes it profitable to produce false but click-worthy stories. So this is our culture of distrust. This obviously are quotes from youth in Skopje or Macedonia who were some of the largest perpetrators of this culture of spreading fake news. And one of the youth that created it, it's a very interesting quote. "You see what people like and you just give it to them," said Dimitri, who asked NBC not to publish his real name. "You see, they like water, you give water. They like wine, you give wine. It's really simple. I didn't force anyone to give me money. People sell cigarettes, they sell alcohol, that's not illegal. Why is my business illegal? If you sell cigarettes, cigarettes kill people. I didn't kill anyone." This is a very important narrative here. Evgeny Morozov has the quote to the left about digital capitalism. The notion that these technologies can spread so far and so wide creates a sense of conflict between how we approach and how we articulate credibility again, and how we think about who's responsible for this. The third and final trend in digital communication, before I put up our solutions and ask us to think about them together, is what we call the agency gap. Now, the agency gap emerges from a culture of spectacle and a culture of distrust to say that we have this gap between concern and the capacity to act, between awareness and action taking is perpetuated by a dependence on technologies to feel aware, but without perceiving pathways to meaningful engagement. So this agency gap, which is the final of these trends, we see here is a classic chart of, I won't show the video, but I'm happy to share it after, of all the amount of civic protests from 1970 to 2014 mapped over the world have increased exponentially. They've increased over time, and specifically when social networks in the early 2000s started to become mainstream. So you saw this real opening and emergence of people talking about civic issues, people talking to and back at journalists, specifically in that role. People using technologies to challenge and question the authenticity of information, people challenging the credibility of information in online networks. And that has grown exponentially. And it's fascinating because emerging from this culture of spectacle, the idea of these networks putting us into groups that don't need to listen to what we consider legacy mainstream media organizations, and allowing them to openly distrust and be validated in their distrust, has created this culture of people articulating concern at all spaces. And I ask what can happen but when we identify problems but not solutions as a society. You guys will be aware of many of these protests around the world, from Black Lives Matter in New York City to Occupy Wall Street in Hong Kong, and of course Tahrir Square, to Ukraine, to Brexit, to the protests in my country, Greece. We have seen this articulated as a technological phenomenon, something where our devices are there to help us articulate concern, but not need to understand how to act and how to be in society. And I think that's important for news and digital communications because it talks to us about control, about how people articulate agency, about the need for people to receive credible information. And we have this notion of click here to save the world. So I'm going to transition into my solutions, but I want to, you know, Wael Ghanim, he's one of AUC's graduates, master's MBA student in marketing and finance, and also known as Civic. Quite somewhat controversial, but I'm only using his words because I think they're appropriate for how we articulate this agency gap. He said in his book and TED Talk, if you want to liberate a society, all you need is the internet. I was wrong. The same tool that united us to topple dictators eventually tore us apart. Now I want to say he identifies 5 things that digital technologies do that get in the way of the ability for journalists to do their jobs as they have always done it. We don't know how to deal with rumors. They spread too fast. So these technologies can articulate rumors. There was a story yesterday in the New York Times about a town in Idaho that had an issue with a sexual assault case, and the town blamed a few of their Syrian refugees. And the Syrian refugees, before the journalists could report on the story and before they could get facts, there had been a large campaign online that it was these people, and then online alternative media started showing the story, and then Russian Twitter bots got involved, and before anything could happen, the rumors had spread so fast that people started to believe vastly different things, and it ended up in a tragedy for the victim and for the students and for the youth that were falsely blamed. We tend to only communicate with people that we agree with. We talked about that before. Online discussions quickly descend into angry mobs. We are forced to jump to conclusions. And our digital experiences favor broadcast over engagement, post over discussion, and shallow commitment over deep interaction. So this is I think these make a lot of sense. It's very hard to have reasoned dialogue online because information moves so fast. It's hard to follow the nuance of a story. You must jump to conclusions. And we are talking at, we are not talking with, because we do not have that real engagement. So this, to me, leads me to the last slide I'll put up is strategies on how we can best navigate this digital landscape. So the three trends that I've identified that I've been writing about and doing research on are spectacle, distrust, and agency gap. And I think these are really, really important for thinking about the future of journalism and the future of communication and storytelling, because this is the culture that we're in. And it doesn't look like a culture that's reforming anytime soon. So within those trends, I've been working with my colleagues and my graduate students in Boston to identify how we best navigate this digital landscape. And I'm going to put up what we're calling reimagining storytelling for civic intentionality. I'm going to put up approaches and tactics, and this is quite new, and this is something that I'm working on in my newest book, as I mentioned. But they are ways that I think we need to start approaching storytelling, whether it's from the point of being a journalist or a filmmaker or a civic media practitioner that's working in communities to help solve social problems. The way that we respond to these trends in how we approach storytelling from the point of cultivating agency. Stories that cultivate agency allow people to understand their identity and their space in society and ways that they can meaningfully contribute, understanding the trade-offs and negotiations of that. So agency is really important in how we approach our storytelling and reporting. Who are we talking about? What is the social problem? What are we trying to do? I think you can cultivate agency without compromising the traditional or the hallmarks of how we think about reporting, credible and fair reporting. The second approach I have is looking at storytelling as a mechanism for caring. Too often, our communication structures now, because they are because they are in times of polarization and partisanship brought on by spectacle and distrust, have simply, because also that news organizations are more tied to the need for profit or the need for competition, they have simply been reaffirming in their approach one-sided or partisan dialogue, so taking very strict stances. And I think that's important at times, but I think caring ethics, where we help people understand what they care for and what they care about, is really important in how we approach storytelling. Caring for is really a relational thing. What do we care for? What are we going to spend the time to care for? And caring about is showing our concern. This is where we get into issues of social justice. And lastly, the approach is critical consciousness. So the idea is that we approach storytelling from the point of understanding our resources and our positions of our position in society. When we make decisions, understanding that we are thinking about using the resources we have. Now, I say that these approaches, I was mentioning these approaches in Beirut just a month ago in a project that I'm involved with there for the last 6 or 7 years. And these approaches are different. They're different in Cairo, they're different in Hong Kong, they're different in Salzburg, Austria, as they are different in Boston and in Mexico City. These approaches to storytelling, for what I call civic intentionality, need to be based in an understanding of the community and of the risks and of the trade-offs of that local space. So there are a different set of contributions for people working in communication capacities in Egypt, for example, than there are even in Lebanon or Jordan or Syria. And those are different from what we do. But I do think that that the way that we can think about storytelling strategies that help respond to some of these trends is to focus on some of these approaches. And then my tactics are emerging along these lines. Persistent engagement, the idea that we must be persistent in how we engage with stories, and we must follow them, and we must have criticality. And persistence, for me, counters this idea of the need for digital and social technologies to make people continuously forget and re-remember, because that's how they are designed to extract the most data and the most revenue. So persistent engagement is there to make sure that we are constantly following and articulating stories over time. The second one is delegitimating spectacle. So these two come specifically from the trend. So as journalists, I always wonder, I've been doing a lot of work with the Washington Post recently in their digital engagement team. And at the Washington Post, there is a real tension between the need to put Chartbeat, this is a technology Chartbeat, which shows how much clicks and engagement stories are getting. And there's a need, just like there is a need for a store that's selling soap to find out how much soap they sell. Journalists are consistently looking at how much engagement their stories are getting and balancing that with what stories they should be telling. And I will tell you that this is a very real conflict. And seeing how this works in newsrooms across the United States, there is, for example, there was a story about a dentist in Minnesota who shot and killed a lion in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know if you remember this story. You might not have made it there. It was a story about a hunter who accidentally killed a lion in a preserve. That story was reserved for some blogs, for some stories. There was some outrage. Every news organization, from the New Yorker to the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times to the Washington Post in the United States, ran headline stories about that lion. There was that lion became one of the most clicked on things, and there was not really a resonance in terms of what the story meant or a notion of why the story should be at the front page. I think it's appropriate that we cover these things, but hearing it straight from the word of the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, this was a story simply so that they could get engagement because it was sensational. How do we delegitimate spectacle? how do we take more care to pick the right stories? That's a very hard question, and something that I don't have all the answers for yet, but a strategy that we need to work on. And I'll end with this notion of countering distrust. How can we find avenues to be transparent in our networks, to have reciprocity with our communities, and to make sure we're connecting on bounds that are based on some of our approaches. So, ProPublica, for example, lets everyone have the data that's in the back of their stories. The Wall Street Journal has started doing these really fascinating pieces where they show how journalists cover stories, and they do this really transparent back end into the way that stories are covered. These organizations are trying to be reciprocal in what they give back to communities. So whenever they're covering stories, they ask, what will this do to the community and how can we give back to the community? That these tactics are important in this digital age for journalists and community practitioners doing work to start to fight back or start to respond to some of the trends and work towards really kind of meaningful engagement, what I consider meaningful engagement in their world. And civic intentionality is really about journalism and communication coming back to its foundations, putting that at the front, that we need to have more intentionality about how we are serving citizens and not simply playing in the spaces that have now been designed simply as extractive profit-making networks. So I just threw a lot at you there, and I'm going to stop here. I have a bunch of examples at the end of this slide deck that I'm happy to share this with you and provide this for you at the end. But I'd love to stop my formal talk now, and thank you for spending the time to listen and hopefully answer any questions you may have. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, Paul, and you raised some points that really drive me to look at issues of concern. One of the issues is the issue of distrust. Second issue is the issue of cultural identity and national identity with this fake news and the overwhelming kind of information is really approaching individuals and groups within a specific nation, and how impact and influence this kind of fake news affecting them. There are other questions that I put down for you, but I would like very much to get some sense from the audience, and maybe they have questions for you. Questions? And if you're going to have a question, please come over here.
I also wanted to let everyone know that today's session will be sending around a link for everyone you can watch, as well as the PowerPoint presentation itself.
Excellent.
So I know some people are taking pictures. Don't have to worry about that. We'll actually send it out to you so you can look at it.
There are some hard copies here if you want, and for the rest, you can just write your emails and we'll send it.
Questions? If you would have questions, I have one. Okay, so I'm going to start. Paul, how would you say media can counter the surge of fake news channels and sources that are gaining popularity at the expense of trustworthy news?
Thank you, and that's a great question, and I imagine one way that I think about this is, well, so first, how we define the media. We are thinking about legacy media institutions. So I think the first thing the media needs to start doing is equating fake news with with stories that are being told from a particular bias or a particular angle, because again, that legitimates fake news, and it places fake news in the context of everything could be fake news that people don't agree with. So I would say that fake news is a very specific technological phenomenon that is born out of an age of lack of regulation and really strong technologists with political angles. So if we understand fake news that way, and that's the way we can start to talk about it, instead of fake news is every story that's trying to distort or manipulate something, then we can really focus on the problem. And for me, I think that's a really important distinction to be made. And so I think the way that you counter that is you counter that by doubling down on trust and transparency. It's very interesting on what the media can do, because a reader, for example, that in the United States, for example, if I go back to this story that happened in Idaho that was just out in the New York Times, there was a refugee population that was resettled there, or we can look in stories in Germany as well. Did a report and research on that. Communities that were part of resettlement of refugees into them, that were against them, are looking for any information to that can help justify or validate their feeling towards immigration or refugee populations. So therefore, when they are online constantly in these networks and having things shared to them, they're less concerned with is that story true or not, and more concerned with, is this something I can share to let people know that we shouldn't be having refugees or immigrants settling in our community. That is a really, really difficult, that's a really difficult thing for a media organization to respond to. And I don't know what the answers for me would be. That we need to reinvest in local media organizations who are building trust and who have enough resources to be sharing and combating these type of stories in real time. That's the way that you do it on the journalism level. And then on the technological level, I would argue that we need to start to regulate these technology companies that allow, Twitter, for example, that allows bots to be built that share fake news faster than any human can respond to. I think that's irresponsible. I think Twitter and Facebook, because their revenues are so high, have kind of said, it's not our responsibility. But now I actually think it's directly their responsibility, because they allow these things to exist, and they allow them to exist to do as much harm as they might do good. So I would say that, we need to double down on the ability for our local media outlets to be engaged in their communities and start to advocate that technology companies get regulated to not allow this stuff to be happening so often.
Thank you very much. This is actually a wonderful answer, and allow me to quote you when I raise these points with local media over here. Would you please come over here? Come over here. Just when she, quick answer. Is really fake news debated among the American public, or is it just like here? Over here, we don't even know the right term for fake news.
It's a widely debated topic in the United States, and my fear in the United States is because it's such like a hot button issue. The term has grown so much because of what we've been going through with our elections, that it's being used more and more in, there are fake news conferences and fake news seminars and fake news panels. And I think because there's a real sensationalism around it, and every time we go there, I hear the same thing. Like, we need good journalism to fight fake news. And I often say, like, no, actually we have great journalism. Journalism doesn't need to fight fake news, because fake news is not a journalistic problem. It's not a problem that journalists are doing this. Fake news is a problem of technology companies and really savvy citizens that have specific ideologies. And so when we start to say fake news is the opposite of journalism, we compromise the work that journalists do. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, I'm Dina Souifi. I'm a PR consultant in the Rada Marketing Research and Public Relations Company. And we're very involved with communication, the media and everything, and corporates. Our problem, I think, here, or the question is that we have actually a dilemma now in the Egyptian society, especially after the 25th of January revolution, that the digital media and the digital platforms have taken over. And at the same time, the traditional media, what we call the newspapers, the TV, everything else, has also become kind of biased. So you have biases on both sides, lack of transparency on both sides. So actually, because people are distrusting more the traditional media, and because there are a lot of biases, obvious biases, and actually fabricated news and fake news on the side of the traditional media, people tend to believe and give credibility more to the online and the Facebook and Twitter and the social media on these platforms. So yeah, so it's very likely that people will tend to trust more if there are fake news on the social media. At least they don't believe it's institutionalized. It's not an institution behind it sending you messages, but it's people, maybe pressure groups, or maybe some people with similar ideologies, and then you're more open to it. So I don't know how you can deal with this, because you are targeted from both sides.
I mean, thank you for that comment. It is a very complicated, it's a very complicated time. And again, I think this is, some of the things that I was articulating earlier is really that these, and I think we're at a specific change point, that these networks that started as open spaces for dialogue have become, like most technology regimes, they've become commodified. So, news, when we say people are going to Facebook for their news, they're actually, we have a really muddled system. Like, the news organizations are going there because they need to, because that's where audiences are. And when they go there, they start to compete they have no control over the algorithm, so they have no control over where their information goes. And they're competing with people, alternative news sources, with people sharing their opinions, with people sharing other blogs and websites, with bots and other algorithms that people put in the system. So it's vastly complicated. And the idea that the responsibility is on citizens to better understand this, that's really difficult, because I think we all know as citizens. So I'm studying this constantly, and when I go on Facebook, I do the same thing that other people do. I get mad at some stories and I get happy at others, and I start to click through all these crazy things. That's a very human implicit response system. I think we need to think again about journalism, not in the context of these networks, but really double down on, like, what's the role of storytellers to really engage and involve communities again, and how does that work? And when I talk to activists and political groups around the world, oftentimes I tell them, like, let's not start with the platform. Don't think about Facebook or YouTube or videos. Think about the community and what you need to do to get to a point that matters. And I think journalists need to do the same thing, and then allow the technologies to support their goal with storytelling or their goal with reporting, and not simply think about the platform first. So it's important.
Thank you very much. Now, please.
Hi, Paul. This is Rasha Alem, Assistant Professor at the Journalism and Mass Communication Department. I want to thank you first for a very interesting and informative presentation. My question goes to the initiative of the newspapers in the US, if there are any initiatives to solve or to deal with the fake news. Here in Egypt, it's mainly very popular to have this fake news for political gain or economic gain. Some of the newspapers, they started to think about tracking the source of the news and track or watch on which platforms on the social media it is spread. But I think that this might lead to more war between the news organization. So are there any initiatives in the U.S. that the newspapers, U.S. newspapers have taken in order to fact check the news before it is widespread on social media platforms? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's a really important question, and I think that news organizations, there's a lot of fact-checking initiatives, and there's a lot of trust initiatives, and a big foundation, the Knight Foundation, just launched in partnership with the Democracy Fund here in the United States, and the New York Times and a few other papers, a whole trust initiative. So, I think not a lot of organizations have put out, we have news literacy projects that are putting out trust and fact sheets and how to assess information. What I've seen that I've found the most impactful that journalism organizations are trying to do is kind of open the hood of their operations to show how they work. And I think that has been very successful. So I mentioned the Wall Street the Wall Street Journal before, and what they've been doing to be very transparent in how they tell stories and show the behind the scenes way that journalists work. And they're doing that as a way to build trust and combat the technological phenomena of how things get reported and how they don't, and what goes into storytelling. And they have a really interesting, if you go on their website, and I'm happy to share the link, I forget the name now, but they have a whole section of really short and nice videos that show how reporting gets done and how stories get told. There's a group called Muckrock that's based in Cambridge, but they are, Muckrock's an organization that helps journalists collect information for free, like set up, and like we have this Freedom of Investigative Act, FOIAs, and they work with journalists to help get them in classified or sensitive information that they need. And I think that's a really powerful way that that organization is working with journalists to help them find information they need. ProPublica has a really cool open data initiative where they're asking their audiences to openly fact check their work and use their data that they get to report stories, which I also think is I think one of the part that this is being, that they are trying to combat fake news is not to specifically create, like you said, to create a direct connection, but to show the transparency of their information. It's really interesting. After our election here in the United States in 2016, I can't believe it was even less than a year ago. It feels like that was 10 years ago. We have had there's been a large surge in people subscribing and supporting to mainstream media as a response to this, because I think there was a quite a significant pushback against people feeling like they didn't have credible information. And I think our newspapers are trying to keep them engaged by being more transparent with them and showing them ways that they can better look behind stories. And that's kind of the way that they get towards credibility.
My name is Mihailidis. I'm a communication and media arts student at AUC. My question was, how would we go about fighting or countering the fact that news agencies or media outlets are becoming more concerned with publishing profit-making stories as opposed to publishing more newsworthy stories?
Right. That's a fascinating question, Hamid. Thank you very much. And this is something that I have been really part of the work we're doing next summer in our global journalism program in Salzburg is with the Washington Post, and they're sending over some of their digital journalists and digital engagement team to work with us, and that is a really big tension. So this idea of the stories I mentioned about the need to profit and get engagement, and I don't know how many people are familiar with Chartbeat, but if you haven't, you should go read about Chartbeat, because it's fast. It is this real pressure on news organizations to be building engagement with their readers and larger followings. And the answer is perhaps not, I don't know if the answer is to have more public financing in our media, because that doesn't seem to be working any better. I mean, my response to this is number one, we need to put pressure on regulating technology companies. So, and I shouldn't be calling them technology companies. So, for example, Facebook and Google, they specifically call themselves technology companies and not media companies, because it absolves them from being regulated by overseers about the ethicality and morality of their content. And as they continue to do that, they continue to have to they continue to subvert some of the regulations placed on media producers about what they can and cannot say. So I think number one is more enforcement of how these companies allow for example, advertising to be, a newspaper cannot put an advertisement that says, like ban Muslims, or they cannot put an advertisement that says, denying a war or denigrating a sex or an ethnicity or a race. But technology companies can do that. ProPublica did an amazing reporting project a month ago where they actually put they went into Facebook, and underneath their journalism stories, they put very offensive targeted advertisements. And they placed these into the Google AdWords and the Facebook backend. And these were accepted without anybody overseeing them. And there was a bit of how can you allow an organization to publish a story on Facebook and then target, for example, one of the ads was like Jew hating and white supremacy in the United States, and those ads went right away. And I think that needs to be regulated. If those aren't regulated, then journalism organizations are always going to be competing. And the second thing I think is that we might need to start thinking about how you can re-engage your community and how you can build sites that are specifically about community engagement and not just putting things onto Facebook. Because I do think that people want to find a sense of connectivity and want to find a sense of meaning. And the more that local journalism has been underfunded and undersupported, the harder it's been for them to find those connections. And I think that could be within those networks, or we might need to be starting to think about other networks and pathways to re-engaging our local communities. So that's the best I have right now.
Well, on the question of regulation, when you mentioned regulating Twitter and Facebook, this is going to be an internal kind of regulation from the companies themselves, or this is a UNESCO or UN task?
I think that there has to be some of both, right? I think, Facebook, for example, has been, I was at a seminar the other week with one of Facebook's lead news editors. She was trying to say, like, we need to do a better job ethically of overseeing what we publish. And I think they are in, the same as, the New York Times has the same problem of how you ensure profit margins to shareholders while putting out content that's regulated. The New York Times mission, though, is to provide you with, that's their mission statement is a journalism organization. That is what they're doing, where Facebook has no ethical obligation. So I think part of it has to be on the companies themselves, understanding the weight that they play in civic life and civil society is no longer, it's no longer, small scale, but they are in the middle of this. And with that comes responsibility. So they need to regulate that. And then I do think local governments, again, I can talk about my experiences in Europe and the United States. Europe does this quite well. They're ahead of the United States in regulating what Google can do, what it can keep, how it can talk to you. And in the United States, the government needs to also step up to classify these companies as media companies and put them to the same standards as they would a television station or a radio station.
But in your presentation, there was a bullet on because of the incredible flow of information every day. This kind of content regulation is impossible.
Right. I mean, it's not. I think it's not. I think that type of regulation is impossible for. I think it's impossible, but I think the problem is that. That Facebook is allowing, or for example, any of these technology companies, they're allowing any content, so personal, private, marketing, news, all to be put in with one another. And I think that is part of what's harmful for the ethicality of this. So what I would say is we don't need to regulate these tools and what they say. We need to make them more clear about, how they understand, the way that they design their algorithms to put news in with really incendiary and false comments. Because the flow of news might be a good thing. Like Twitter, for example, I think is still the best tool for real-time aggregated news content that citizens can self-curate. Like I can put all my favorite media outlets and journalists and have a real-time feed. But that should be, there should be a standard where that cannot be manipulated by organizations that are advocating for hate or for harm or for mass oppression. And I guess that would be my argument for regulation, not to stop the flow of content.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Hi, Paul. This is Salma
Hi.
Ghani from the Adham Center. I've recently completed my MA in Journalism Mass Communication with a concentration on media literacy in international schools. Yeah, and we've met in Beirut. So
Yeah.
there was this interesting notion that was discussed there about if you're not paying for it, then you are the product. And how the algorithms of social media outlets factor in our big data to make money out of our interests and our opinions and such. But my question is now with the increase in the presence of news organizations like news wires like Reuters and AP and other channels on social media, they are also making use of the same algorithms and of the same big data to sell us news. So the ethical aspect of it all and the digital aspect of it all, if you can touch base on it.
Yeah, well, thank you and congratulations. It's nice to see you again. I think that is the quote that our colleague Dr. Shumo put up with on a free, if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. I think that's exactly right. And I think we all understand the trade-off, right? That we have advertising, we give data. And I think that the news outlets I guess the question is, the news outlets are using the same algorithm because that's where the most readers are and that's where the most profits lie. And I guess my question would be that we don't need to get away, we don't need to step outside of those networks, but I think that we are starting to reach an ethical point, a point of ethics where those stories are their stories being consumed. So because the news organizations, I could put it this way, are competing with all the other tidbits of sensationalized information and everything else that's being placed on there without any bounds to ethics or news or values or support, the news are starting to use the same tactics in how they create headlines, for example, like BuzzFeed does, or like the Huffington Post or Breitbart News or any of these alternative media outlets are, because they need to compete with them. I guess that's not quite a bad thing, but I think that compromises the integrity of the process. When news organizations have to put more sponsored content like they do, and they have to put much more sensationalized headlines to get people to click into things, that creates a problem for how people respond to it. I think that perpetuates this notion of spectacle. Everything has to be more spectacular, because when there's millions of pieces of information competing for audience at the same time, it becomes harder for the New York Times to put in, or any real journalist outlet to put in a long form story over time. And I think, and the second part of this that I think is, that I think we have to worry about, in addition to the fact that they're now competing, is the way that these algorithms work. Is that the algorithms work to say that if you click on stories that are sensational, or if you click on more of one type of thing, then you start to get exposed to similar things that are of that sensational nature. So I consider this like normalizing spectacle, is that like in Facebook, all of the things that we want to see that become the most click-worthy are what we get the most exposed to, because that gives them the most data. And news either has to compete in that, or they have to find another way. And I think, when Moses and I have talked about this for a long time, about whether if you opt into that, can you help reform the algorithm? But as humans, we are naturally inclined to go to the most spectacular things and do what's cognitively easiest, which is to read tidbits and headlines and short videos. And I don't know how valuable, really deep news is in those spaces, or can it respond to that?
Is it the responsibility of the local local media organizations or media channels, or is it also the responsibility of those who are defined as the mainstream media, affecting the entire world?
I mean, I think you have to share the responsibility of this. The mainstream media, I think, I think there's a lot of really good journalism being done, and they are still, at least in the United States, we know that their numbers have kind of spiked again. This whole notion of people paying for journalism, their numbers have increased significantly in 2017, largely as a backlash to a lot of this, the fake news. If it's done any good that we have this kind of culture of distrust, it's that a lot more people have started to pay for news again, which was not happening, in the first 10 or 12 years of massive social networks. And that's a positive thing. But I think where we've been really hurt is in the local media organizations who don't have those structures. They don't have the significant technologies and the pay scales, and they don't have as much resources. And there's been experiments that have failed. In the United States, in New York City, I was one of the first people involved with this initiative called Patch. I don't know if anyone has heard of Patch or if you've been in the United States. Patch was started by AOL and USA Today and a couple of organizations to put local news, to have every town or every couple of towns get local news. And they would put one editor and they would freelance stories. And we had a newsroom at the university I was at where young local journalists, and there was just not enough support for that type of structure when communities were using these big tools. So, it's a real challenge, and it's a time where a lot of the traditional models for local media are failing, but also an opportunity to rethink about different ways that we can really kind of, my notion about this caring approaches and approaches of agency, that you guys who are the future storytellers are going to invent the models that re-engage local communities and do it meaningfully. And I think we're at this time where there's so much space for innovation, and we have to take advantage of that. So,
thank you very much.
My name is Mihailidis. I was talking a minute ago. I have another question. My question was, how do you, like you mentioned during the presentation, that people are becoming increasingly isolated and exposed to people who share their same ideas and opinions. How do you get people to become more exposed to other ideas or other opinions?
Right. I mean, this is another good question. You must be one of the top students in your in your institution. This notion of polarization and partisanship is fascinating. That I was reading something on the dying art of disagreement this morning about how we forgot, even going back to some of the earliest thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, that would be in these wonderful disagreements with each other, and that we've lost the ability to disagree. And I think largely that's, again, because we're spending so much time in these networks that reinforce self-supporting groups that share ideologies and values. And so, we know from decades of research that people feel the most validated in how they believe the world when their peers support them, not when their families do, not when their organizations do, but when your peers tell you that you're right, and when your peers are in agreement with you, it justifies your views more and more. So when people are sharing stories, or when people are posting things, stories that are one way, they care, and their peers are liking them and retweeting them and appropriating them, that validates us more. So this is a big question. It's a big problem of when the more we get reinforced by people that think like us, the more it gives us a sense of confidence, and the less we feel we need to listen to dissenting opinions. So, the only thing I could say is this notion of human connectivity is one way that we can the one way that you can overcome this is like reinvesting in community, reinvesting in the connectivity and the negotiation that comes with community efforts. So I have seen fascinating change in, in doing community projects where we spend significant time with communities, bringing people together and having them think about local social problems. So I was working with one graduate students with the, you guys know the Zeppelin community or the Zeppelin issue in Egypt and Cairo, who's working with that community to help them re-engage their business and their industry. And she's from Cairo and she just finished our graduate program. And she was talking about how many misunderstandings there were between the Zeppelin community and some of the other communities that were there and their relationship with the government. And she was holding these community meetings where people were coming to talk. And the amount of overcoming some of these assumptions and some of these values simply through investing into community dialogue was fascinating. And, I can only say that the way we do this is the more we can find ways to bring communities together and have them negotiate and be in connection is one of the only ways we can solve that problem of this partisanship.
Thank you very much. Among the community members of the community of Zeppelin, some of them are among the richest in Egypt, and also they are sometimes on television talking about issues of concern. Interesting. Now, because we're running out of time, we have 5 minutes or so. I want to pick your mind, and I want you to give me a forecast about the field of journalism in the light of distrust, in the light of fake news, in the light of citizen journalism, and in the light of transnational, transcultural flow of information that is happening in the world. In addition, this is only one. In addition, what will happen to cultural preservation? What is a responsive cultural preservation? Cultural identity. There are out of your presentation, I was thinking, with all kinds of flow of information coming to individuals. And right now, a lot of Egyptians are wired now with smartphones, with 4G. We're going to celebrate it actually immediately after your presentation, introducing 4G to the country. And a lot of people are going to stream. So the change of culture, what we defined as the download culture to or into the streaming culture, which is bringing with it a lot of concerns with regard specifically to the point that you have mentioned. So what's the forecast? What will happen in the next 20 years or so? I'm not going to say
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. I cannot answer that. I'm sorry. This is, this is a very, I can answer that I will try to answer this briefly, but with the same provocation. So I think that from what I have seen happening in the last 5 or 10 years of researching this, is that there is I think we're reaching this peak saturation point of these networks. And I think what I've been seeing is I've been in a lot of communities working with local journalists and local organizations and local community stakeholders. I think there's going to be I think that we are going to be heading into a time of real rich abilities for journalists to engage with their communities again. And I think there's a space now for a lot of innovation in the way that storytelling happens, and for basically a reimagination of what does it mean to be a journalist, and what does it mean to report, and what does it mean to be engaged in audiences. So, so for example, the New York Times, how much longer do we simply call that a journalism organization? Or how do we call that? Or is that simply now another media organization that's operating under specific constraints? How do we think about trust and credibility? For me, I think forecasting the future of journalism in this space is that there's going to be, once these large networks in a backlash to what's happening now. Once they become more regulated, or there's a demand on them by people to make them more and more accountable to civil society, then we're going to see a new vibrant opening up of avenues for storytelling. And I think that's important. And I think what you call the streaming culture is going to be part of that. That this saturation of connected cell phones is also going to shift the way that we approach and we appropriate content. I think culture is more important than the technology or anything, and I'm continually fascinated by the use of culture to bring people together and the use of culture to connect, and that we have almost lost sense of that as we've kind of gone into this globalist sense of information's coming from everywhere, and we all can say everything about anything, and it creates this really. It creates a really dangerous potential for us to be reducing complex cultures into these streamlined depictions of I'm against this idea. And I think part of what journalists need to do is really double down on culture, and citizens need to really acknowledge that and use culture to connect and not to divide. And a lot of times, because we are forced to respond to global narratives, we use culture in such general ways that it becomes this happens in America and Egyptians do this, and that really diminishes culture. And that's a scary thing that I think that also helps to spread distrust. And we need to fight to acknowledge culture as the thing that connects us. So that I would say that's super important. Every time I see in my global work cultures come together, I see that potential. And I think that's what drives me to continue to do this work. We just don't know how to translate it yet into networks.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's not one of the best lectures I ever attended, you must understand that we also live in the Middle East, where a lot of civil wars, failed countries, and a lot of instability, terrorism. A lot of things are interconnected with a concept that has to do with fake news, and we understand that we have major concerns with regard to the issues that you have addressed today brilliantly. Thank you again for being with us, and I hope to see you in person soon.